Hello, everyone. Welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Noah Mintz. I'm the store's event coordinator, and Community Bookstore is celebrating over 50 years in business, and we credit the continued support of readers and writers for this milestone. Thank you for spending the evening with us. I'm thrilled today to welcome Abby Seiff for the release of her book, Troubling the Water, A Dying Lake and a Vanishing World in Cambodia, in conversation with Gabriella Burnham. Now to some housekeeping, we've enabled Zoom's auto-transcribe setting, so if your version of Zoom is up to date, click the live transcription button at the bottom of your screen to enable closed captions. If you have any questions for tonight's guests, please click on the Q&A button, which is also at the bottom of your screen. To submit those, we will be asking them at the end of the program, so please don't be shy. There's also a chat box through which I will be posting a link to buy tonight's book if you haven't already. And one caveat for tonight is that we're all at the mercy of our home internet connection, so please bear with any tech issues that might arise. We'll try to solve them quickly. We have a great lineup of events planned for you as we head into spring, so head over to our website, communitybookstore.net, and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date. One that I want to point out in particular is next Wednesday, March 30th. We're thrilled to welcome M. Lund for her new novel, The Boy with a Bird in His Chest, in conversation with Isle McElroy. That program is up on our website now and taking registrations. So now, a little about tonight's guests, and we'll get started. Abby Seiff is a journalist and editor who was based in Southeast Asia for nearly a decade, writing for publications like Time, Al Jazeera, Mekong Review, and Pacific Standard, among others. Her reporting has garnered several awards, as well as fellowships from Yaddo and the Logan Nonfiction Program. She is currently studying for an MFA at Brooklyn College. And Gabriella Burnham's debut novel, It Is Wood, It Is Stone, was named a Best Book of the Year by Harper's Bazaar, Marie Claire, Publishers Weekly, and Good Housekeeping magazines. She holds an MFA in creative writing from the Writers Foundry at St. Joseph's College and has been awarded fellowships to MacDowell and Yaddo. She and her partner live in Brooklyn, New York, with their two rescue kitties, Galetta and Franz. So now, without any further ado, I will hand it off to you. Abby, Gabby, thank you both so much for being here tonight.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Community Bookstore for hosting this event. I'm going to start off just getting something out of the way, and that is that I love this book so much. It is so soulful, so impactful. And even though it's a book that's about a specific lake in a specific country, it feels so relevant to our global economy and climate change generally. So Abby, would you start us off by reading a passage that you've chosen?
Yes, thank you, Gabby. Thank you so much for being here today. And thank you, really, Noah and Community Bookstore for setting this up. It means a lot to me. I live in Brooklyn and I love your bookstore. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read from the first chapter. It's called The Tiger Depends on the Forest. And in this book, maybe we'll go over it a bit, but each chapter kind of deals with a different catastrophe that's affecting the lake or a different aspect of how people are dealing with that. And so this is, I kind of call it my climate change chapter. So I'll just start at the very beginning and we can take it from there. Charred forest has a curious smell. Sweet and acrid both, the soil somehow pure, the air wood rich. In May 2016, the forest at the northern tip of the Tonle Sap isn't razed to the ground. Trees still stand in sliding lines against a baby cloud sky, but they are mostly blackened skeletons. Leaves turn dust in the recent conflagration. A small river leads from the lake through the protected wetlands at Tonle. Fire has transformed its landscape. For months now, blazes have been stalking across the flooded forest rimming the lake. These are unprecedented occurrences. I talked to people in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, and no one has ever seen this kind of thing before. Wildfires, so common in the rest of the world, are rarities in Cambodia's flooded forests. But here they have come, flames blowing high, sparks jumping from one dry patch to the next, all near the largest body of freshwater in Southeast Asia. By the time they burn out, the fires have reached a third of the Tonle Sap's forest and wetlands, damaging hundreds of square miles and killing countless animals. Cheng Lom is my guide through this erased land. She is tiny and voluble with a half grin that pulls the wrinkles from her necks and cheeks. Lam pats my arm as she marches us forward, even as small fires still smoke further in. It looks like charcoal underfoot, a fine layer of pure black coating the red soil. It's so dry here that clumps of dirt have pulled apart in jagged circles and squares. A few green shoots push up improbably through the cracked earth. Tall golden stalks of grass and weeds catch at the faint breeze. A mess of twigs are tangled above the blackened ground. I don't know why it's so hot and dry. I've never seen that before. I'm 66 and this is the first time I ever saw these fires, she says. When we turn back from the forest, crossing the land where it shears from the fire line, I see that a section of her garden has been spared the flames. It's a strange sight, the strong young plants, leafy and full, set against molting trees. There's a thin fence around some seedlings, lines of old fishing netting held up by sticks. She points out where she has sown new crops. I started to plant some vegetables again. I don't know if they'll grow, she says. At the edge of her garden stands a blackened tree with crown of coppered leaves, wrapped with the bright green of a vine untouched by the blaze. 20 feet in front of us, her small wood house lists on its stilts. Another 10 feet ahead, the water hits the shore. I've lived here for more than 30 years and have never seen a fire here in my life. It started from the canal over there, then the wind brought it here. It lasted 2 days. We used water pumps to try and stop it, but it wasn't enough, she says. While speaks, she smooths her clothes, orange chains wrapped around the indigo leaves of her skirt. A soft patch of pumpkin plants furl away from them, their butter yellow flowers catching out the sun. For days, neighbors gathered at this river, dragging hoses and motorized pumps from home to home to keep the flames at bay. Monks joined, and officers, the more able-bodied among them moving deeper into the forest, which is an important bird sanctuary. What is a small hose to an inferno? The speed and power was like gas burning, one neighbor recounts. Birds fell from the sky as in some dark tale. That the waterside houses and gardens had been spared at all spoke to the superhuman effort. All of the villagers came to help, Lam's husband, Seng Kim Long, tells me. If we hadn't, the whole village would have burned. But now the woods are crumbling, and Lam wonders what will happen once the water begins to rise with the rainy season, and the houses are ready to float inland with the lake. She says, in the wet season, we move to this area and tie our houses to the trees. Everyone here does that. She gestures at the splintering forest behind her. If this tree is still alive, I can tie my home during wet season. If it's dead, I can't. Thanks, Gabby.
Oh, gosh, that chapter, like, yeah, it's the having to tie your house to the tree and then the tree burns. Wow. You know, like the overwhelming sense that I got while I was reading Troubling the Water is that it's a time capsule in a way, like that you're writing a story about a natural resource that will inevitably disappear. And so this book is kind of containing the lake in a sense. You write that an estimated 2 million Cambodians directly rely on the Tonle Sap Lake to make a living. So I was wondering, for readers that haven't read the book yet, can you just kind of like set the stage of what this lake means to the people who live in that region, which is like a third of Cambodia?
Yeah, so this lake is, I'm going to do a very brief sort of hydrology geography, but I'm sure many of you have heard of the Mekong River. It's about 3,000 miles. It starts in China and it goes through Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam. And the lake is a really, I mean, it's a famous lake. It's like the Amazon, tons of fisheries, a lot of biodiversity, a lot of animals. And in Cambodia, there's a really massive tributary attached to the lake called the Tonle Sap River, and that leads, attached to the Mekong, and that leads up to the lake. And what's very unusual about this lake is it's fed by this river, which reverses course twice a year with the rains. So basically, the Mekong becomes very overfilled. It pushes water into the Tonle Sap River, and that pushes it up into the lake. And then the lake expands up to 6 times its size. And then 6 months later, that changes. The lake kind of drains out into the river and back into the Mekong. And so when we talk about the lake dying, I want to sort of make it clear that it's not like the Aral Sea. Like the lake is not going to disappear I've never heard that said. But what's going to happen, and what's already happening, is this flood pulse that fills the lake is dying out. So, it's only lasting a few weeks now instead of about 5 months. It's coming later and later. It's when it brings water, it's bringing less and less water. And that means it's bringing less fish, it's bringing less nutrients. So we have a real change in how the lake is working because of climate change, because of hydropower. And yeah, so I did, a lot of people ask if there's any hope, and that's, maybe we'll get into that later. I don't know, but I was really trying to capture the tenor of life at the moment, which, I think it's already in quite a bad shape. But what's interesting is everyone you talk to on the lake remembers what it was like not that long ago, because this has all happened in the last decade or two. So even people our age can talk about how many fish they could catch when they're young and how easy it was to be living there. And that's kind of a long, warbly answer to your question, but did I even answer your question?
Yeah, no, that was great. I wonder if you could just give like a little bit of a sense. Well, maybe I'll ask a follow-up question. Like, one thing that I loved about the book is that you focus on the economic impact that the lake dying or not producing as much fish, or the kind of influx of water being more unpredictable, how there's a huge economic impact, but also that like fish and water are such a big part of Cambodian history and folklore. So I guess like from a writing standpoint, maybe could you talk about like how you drew on all of those different threads and develop them, and then kind of weave them together so that you're not just touching on one point of the lake, but like all the ways in which this lake kind of hits on all of different parts of this community.
Yeah, I realize I completely forgot the second half of your question before. You asked about the importance of the lake, and the importance is that it is a huge fishery. So they're pulling in hundreds of thousands of tons of fish a year for sale, but also just for families to rely on. Along the lake, there's all these villages, either on stilts, which are these very tall houses that kind of tower over the lake, or floating villages, which are, boats and floating homes. And those people are all fishers, and they depend on it for their income, but also just for their, families and for their daily food. So, when we talk about the economic impact, there's the direct impact on those people who tend to really be among the poorest and most vulnerable. They don't have land, which is obviously, a critical sense of ownership. All they can do is fish. So they're losing that. Then kind of if we zoom out a little bit, if the lake is not moving nutrients along what's called the floodplain is along the lake. So that's when it floods out. It's not as deep, but it's kind of, that's where all the paddy rice is grown. So if nutrients are not going in, that's affecting agriculture, which is affecting even more people than just the fishermen. And then from a cultural standpoint, this is just such an important lake. In the book, I talk about how the lake helped the city of Angkor grow. So like, if you've ever seen the temples of Angkor Wat, which are obviously, one of these great wonders of the world, those could exist because the lake was so prodigious with fish, but also because they really tapped into the water. They used it to build these temples, to build the village. And that city was something like 1 million people at its height, and that's directly linked to the lake. And so, the lake has always played a role. For instance, there's a water festival every year in Cambodia, and this is a huge holiday. It happens every November, and it's kind of supposed to celebrate the river reversing course. And there's these dragon boat races, and it's like a linchpin holiday. And again, that's tied so distinctly to the lake. So yeah, just every sort of touchstone touches back to the Tonle Sap.
Yeah. Yeah, I found that really so remarkable how you handled that. Because I think going into a book called Troubling the Water, A Dying Lake and Vanishing World in Cambodia, immediately I think of like the climate change impact of that, which especially for a community that relies on fishing, there's an obvious economic impact, but that's not really where you start. You start with a folk tale, if I remember correctly, and sort of like the history of just like how important water is to these people and where they come from. So just from like a writing process perspective, how did you kind of manage all of these different aspects? And how did you go about thinking about how you're going to thread them together into like one coherent narrative?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I did start with a folktale. The folktale is about how kind of the folk legend of how Cambodia came to be, which involves the king blessing a union by drinking the ocean, and then the land that comes is Cambodia. And that obviously really, really ties into the way water works in Cambodia, these floodplains that, you know, fill with water. And if you're flying above it, it looks like, you know, it looks like a lake has covered the country. I didn't find that folktale until I was like halfway through writing this book. But yeah, you know, when I tried a few different approaches to this book, I think I've told you this, that it wasn't exactly the book I wanted to write. I wanted to go back to Cambodia. I wanted to spend a little more time with one or two families and have it be a bit more narratively driven. And that couldn't happen because of the pandemic. But I think when I sort of realized I couldn't do that, what I decided to do was make it kind of thematic, but the lake itself can be the narrative thread throughout. So you know, when I was going in, I wanted to do a few things. One, I wanted the lake to really, a friend suggested this, and she was spot on, that the lake has to emerge as a character itself. So from very early on, we have to have a sense of it, you know, what it looks like, what it feels like. And then I think even if you've never been there, even if you've never heard of this, you can maybe feel a bit of a sense of what's lost, not just from hearing the people talk about it, but kind of from visualizing it. And then, yeah, so I kind of approached it a little bit thematically. There's a chapter where I get into climate change. There's a chapter with the hydropower dams. There's a chapter with overfishing. But I was really certain that I wanted the human stories to be the main crux of each of those. And so there, again, my hands were tied a little bit because I couldn't go back and do more reporting, but I had done quite a bit of reporting in 2016 and 2017. And I just spent a lot of time, like I scraped the marrow of that bone, you know, trying to find people whose voices would reflect a certain issue at hand. And then the second half of the book is a lot more how the different ways that people are coping with it by moving from the lake, by, you know, migrant labor, by trying to get alternative incomes. And yeah, that was kind of my approach. And then lastly, I was also very interested in these historical accounts because, you know, we have oral histories where people talk about what they've seen in their lifetime. And then we have these amazing array of historical accounts, you know, from French colonialists, but even from a Chinese emissary in the 13th century, like, and they're astonishing because like people are so struck by the lake, and that just jumps off the page. Like they are gobsmacked when they see that. And so I thought, you know, I'm not a scholar, and I have a limited like ability to do that type of research, but I did really try to seek down as many of those as I could because I felt that kind of enriched to weave that in a bit.
Yeah, completely. And you say that the lake had to be a character in the book. Like I so felt that, like, and it's because of the way you describe the lake. I found myself like wondering, like, what's the lake doing today? Like when I was turning pages, like, you know, is it a drought time? Is it filled with water? And, you know, and even like different sections of the lake, like this is the lake that's being preserved and that's what that looks like. And it really does come alive because of the treatment you give, just the descriptions. It's so incredible. So I think that, you know, like whenever a writer chooses a topic or a setting or maybe a cast of characters and they decide to write an entire book about it, there must be like some deep connection or at least a sense of commitment to that material. So can you talk a little bit about just like, at what point did you decide like, okay, you know what, I'm going to stick to this. I'm going to write a whole book about the Tonle Sap. Like this is, you know, this is my topic, especially for a first book.
Yeah. It was weirdly a little more organic than that. I took this first reporting trip in 2016. It was a photographer friend whose idea was, because that the passage I read, the forest fires had just happened, and so we were there, and we could even, there was sort of still smoking in the distance, and it was a very bad drought, and he was kind of wanted to see what it was like. So I can't take credit for the idea in the first place, but I was very struck by it. And I was initially interested, I was writing a lot about food security and, you know, what it means that so many people can't get fish and are going hungry. And I applied for a grant to go back the next year, and I went back again, this time with a few more colleagues. And we spent another, you know, week or so there. And we tried to visit some of the people we'd seen before. And, you know, then I was like, yeah, a little bit more into it. And I was writing articles about it. And, you know, I kind of had this vast body of research, and I just kept writing about it. And I went back another couple times. And then I kind of stumbled on some of those historical things, and I was really curious about that. And I sort of wrote an essay where I wove those together, and I thought, that's kind of cool. I like that. And then I guess another year passed. I was back in New York, and I mean, if I'm being very honest, part of how I got into this was there was a nonfiction program I wanted to apply for, and they said, you know, you can apply with a project, and I thought, oh, maybe I should sit down and like try to write a chapter of this possible book. I think before then, I guess the idea must have been there, but I'm not sure without the program if I would have like really said like I could do this. I did that, I got in, and then just, you know, I'm sure you've known this, like just the community of being around other writers and people who are working on things, it can really help kind of propel you forward. And after that, I was like, okay, I'm writing this book, I guess I'm doing this. And
yeah,
like I said, I tried a few different approaches, and then the pandemic came, and that really limited how I could do it. But it was, I mean, for me, it was also like a bit of a blessing to have this to work on during that time.
Yeah. I asked that question, like, when did you decide that you were going to give yourself over to the Tonle Sap, to devote yourself to a book? But I think that most writers would say that like you never really make that choice, that somehow you just find yourself writing an entire book about something, and halfway through you're like, how did this happen? I guess I'm doing this, I'm on board.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, it's funny you say that, because I have a friend, and I remember a few years before I started writing, I sort of was chatting with him and saying, oh, you know, maybe I'll write a book. And he said, well, whatever you pick, be careful, because like you will be at it for years and years. So make sure you're interested in it. And at the time I thought, oh, I'm not going to do anything for years and years. Lo and behold.
I was just curious because there are, you talk about like these sort of historical accounts that you found, and then there's also the oral history that you're collecting from people. And then there's just like geographic facts about how the Tonle Sap works. Then there's also the descriptions of the lake and the people. I mean, there's so many, it feels so effortless the way you move through that, but there's so many elements that you're weaving together. So I was kind of curious, like if there was anything that just didn't make the cut, like that you, like some little fact or something that you wished you could have put in, but if you don't remember right at this moment.
That is a great question. I don't think I'm sure stuff got cut. It's I'm sure you've noticed, it's a very thin book, so not much got cut, but it was a beast of an editing process because, I mean, you notice it's like a lot of vignetting, and I was really constantly moving stuff around to try to, because it's not a narrative, because it's vignettes, I did want to feel like it's woven together, but tightly, and that there's still something that pulls you forward. And I don't know if I succeed. Like that's the really hardest part to do as a writer, but yeah, I was constantly moving things around and trying.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing with shorter form. Like it's about, how many pages is it? Like around the 120, something like that, which that length, I think that's what gave it that precious feeling, that it really is, like I called it a time capsule, but even that we get 100 pages and you contain so much in that, the form evokes what's happening with the lake. I think I really felt that in reading it. I'm most of the time a fiction writer. I try to be a nonfiction writer, and Abby has helped me when I try to do that. But because I think I was reading it as a fiction writer, and like that part of my brain was working as I was reading it, I was just so moved by how transporting it was. Like you said that you wanted people to be, or your reader to be able to see the lake. So I just want to read a section.
Thank you.
Just so we can appreciate how gorgeous this is. Beneath the bruised wood hulls, the water shifts. No longer brackish and still, dishwater dull, set through with oil and soap and the touch of so many people. Here, the lake is spackled silver and it heaves with fish. I mean, that's just like gorgeous writing in the midst of this story that's, a very complicated web of people relying on this lake, the forces that are making it impossible for people to rely on the lake, the forces of climate change that are happening. So I wanted to know, like, at what point did you kind of sit down and decide to capture these images and then just kind of like let your poetry writing, flavor flow?
Yeah, I mean, because again, I was dealing with like a limited body of on the ground reporting, I really wanted any descriptive part to be as evocative as possible. So with that, I was really lucky that I had a lot of photos, stuff I'd taken, but also Nick Axelrod, whose beautiful photos are in the book. He just gave me like, a photo dump. And so I would sit there and like stare at these for a long time and look at my notes and look at like little video clips I'd taken and try to recreate as much as I could of what I'd seen. But it's funny because now that you point that out, obviously, like I sort of stylistically am proud of those. But in my MFA program, we had this big debate last semester about whether having really kind of flowery prose when talking about really, unsettling or unpleasant topics does a disservice to it. And it's not something I had considered before. And I was on the side of it doesn't, that like anything deserves to be described beautifully. But, it is curious because I do wonder, sometimes if it might be, if I had done a different approach, if it had been much more focused on a few characters, a few sources, I suspect I wouldn't have gotten so into that prose, but you know, it's a balancing act.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know if you want to get into that debate now. We might be on the same side of it. But I think that, you know, like, I think you have to constantly think about like the form and the content for sure. And does this form make sense with the content? And with your book specifically, I think the fact that you give such tender description to the lake, it's sort of, it's evoking how precious the lake is to that community. Another version of this book, I think, could have very easily been a much more factual, drier, no pun intended, drier account of the lake. But what you bring in is just like, this lake is, it's extremely meaningful to the day-to-day lives of these people and the shape of their culture. And so when you describe the lake so beautifully, it's like, I get it. I love the lake. I want this lake to stay, you know?
Yeah, there's a reason, you know, songs are written about it, and it's.
Yeah, totally. You mentioned that you're in an MFA program, and I know that you're focusing on fiction writing in the program. So I just wanted to ask, like, as like someone who's done so much journalism work and so much nonfiction writing, what is it like to kind of like make this sort of crossover, or is it not so much of a crossover? Like, what's the relationship feeling like now?
Oh, it's really fun. No, it's definitely a big crossover. They're very different. You know, like on bad days with fiction, I'll really miss aspects of journalism where to get the word count, you have quotes to work with, and you know, rewrite some back copy, and like that you have all of the material. It's just a matter of how to put it down. On the other hand, you know, you don't have the material, you're sort of screwed when you're doing journalism. And so there's something so pleasurable about the way the mind can just run riot and come up with these things. I mean, I highly recommend it to anyone who's thinking of it. The MFA at Brooklyn College, it's the best. And it's nice too to use, you know, like you said, you're starting to write some nonfiction now. It can be really nice to use a different muscle and use a different part of your brain and really think, you know, you're thinking so differently about what the intention is, but also how these things are fitting together. I'm sure it's going to make me a better nonfiction writer too, because I didn't study journalism. I sort of learned on the job, and you know, most of what you do is very practical, and then as you get more experience, you learn how to write better, and you know, that gets woven in too. But to really break writing down into a craft level, to like think kind of in a very intellectual way, I suppose, about what tiny minuscule choices a writer is making. Yeah, it's definitely, it's changing my approach as well.
Yeah, I can't wait to read your fiction and
yeah,
see,
me too.
like, and obviously more of your nonfiction. So you kind of alluded to this earlier, and I know it's sort of taboo to ask the journalist for solutions when they write a book, but I thought it was really curious that you sort of end the book with that air. There's a fisherman who asks you if you know where to get life-saving jackets, like flotation jackets, because there's this ceremonial boat race that happens on the Tonle River, I think, right? And a lot of people have been drowning. And so he's like, we're going to be fine. I know how to swim. I'm a fisherman, but would you by chance know where we could get some flotation jackets? And then there's a woman also who asks you, like, why isn't my garden bearing fruit or vegetables? And in both instances, we don't get your answer. So I kind of wanted to ask you, like, do you feel that there is an answer? Like, do you think that there is a way in which the Tonle Sap could be saved that's not happening right now?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is like I think earlier I quoted a few fishermen. You know, if you ask them, they have really concrete answers, and they're, as far as I can tell, they're pretty spot on. So all of them want to see a lot more enforcement against illegal fishing. Right now, there's a huge illegal fishing problem, but most of the enforcement is against like these small family fishers, and it's kind of like a really sad feedback loop, because the small family fishers are resorting to illegal fishing because they just can't, there's no fish to be had unless they use illegal methods. But cracking down on them is not solving the real problem, which is large scale illegal fishing, which is like happening only due to like corruption or people looking the other way, or and so, you know, illegal fishing is a main thing to do. Sorry about that. Hydropower dams is the other. She agrees. Yeah, hydropower dams is the other really big problem. So we haven't talked about this yet in this, but most of the book is about the impact of hydropower, and the Mekong is not completely, but there's been a number of hydropower dams built on the Mekong and on its tributaries, and that's really changing the downstream hydrology. So, you know, if countries stop building on the main stem, if they stop building on the tributaries, and also if most of those dams are in China, and so there's a push for a lot more cooperation between China and lower countries, and China has been somewhat amenable to this, for China to release water when it's needed downstream, which obviously isn't really in their interest. That's another huge change. Climate change, you know, this is beyond the hands of anyone, but the droughts are just getting worse and worse. I guess we can't say for certain that it's climate change, but it's, you know, the last 10 years have had 8 of the hottest years on record or whatever. So yeah, those are kind of the 3 main things. And then I think there's smaller things that could be done, you know, for instance, just at the individual level, like trying to find alternative opportunities for fishers, so that they don't have to rely solely on fishing, to maybe pull some of the pressure off that resource would help. I don't know. There are solutions out there. There's, you know, people much wiser than me who have talked about those, but those are sort of the overall ones. But in terms of, I mean, I don't know, some people who study this are very skeptical that the hydrology of the lake, that pulse could really return, except in an artificial way. I don't know enough about it to be able to say one way or another, but you could certainly do things to mitigate the current circumstances.
Yeah. So you mean that, and we didn't talk about this, but these like hydraulic dams are preventing the flow of water from getting in from, is it the Tonle Sap River or it's the Mekong feeding into the lake?
Yeah, so the hydropower dams that are upstream, they basically, you know, they hold back a lot of water. So the water isn't flowing exactly as it would naturally. They also impede, especially the tributary dams, they impede migration, and they hold back silt, which is the really nutrient-rich stuff that feeds the crops.
Yeah, this might be naive on my part, but just thinking about like resource hoarding, water never comes to mind for me, but maybe that's because I live in New York City and I never think about like, will I have water today? But that was really powerful. I described that. If the audience has questions, start entering them, and I have a couple more of my own, but we'll get to audience questions soon. So especially if you've been sitting, I always do this. I like sit on. I'm like, I don't know if I should ask a question or not. Just ask it.
Just ask it.
Yeah. So I guess like one thing I wanted to ask is, and you've covered this in different ways, but like, was there did you have a goal of like, I hope if there's one thing that readers walk away from this book feeling or contemplating, it's this. Did you have that kind of like thematic goal in mind when writing, or do you now have it that you're finished writing and it's out there?
I didn't. I mean, I think I said like in the prologue, if this disappears, let this kind of capture a place and a time. And I think mostly I was writing it with that in mind. That said, like, obviously anything that gets more attention or awareness is hopefully valuable, and anything that gets people talking about these issues. You mentioned at the beginning of the program that this is really not unique to Cambodia, and that's kind of echoed in our world and in so many worlds. And not that any of us are unaware of changing climate or changing pressures on resources. And most of us are not in a position to do things about it, but I have to hope as a journalist, like, that awareness plays a role in what gets changed down the line.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, maybe let's, we can turn to some audience questions then. We have a couple here. So we have, you mentioned the unique challenges for a writer of crafting fiction versus journalism. In what ways do you see the two approaches informing each other in your work?
Oh, I love that. So this is like perhaps quite pragmatic, but because in journalism, you're just kind of churning stuff out constantly, and you can't really be too precious about your work most of the time. I think that's really informed my fiction, where I'm not shy about just like pumping it out, and it's not great, but I've never felt like, oh, I need to spend like 8 hours crafting this sentence. So that's a bit of a, I don't know if that's really what they're asking, but to me, there's actually been like one of the most valuable things about having a journalism background and doing fiction, because as I'm sure you see, like, so much of the change in fiction comes through in revision and in editing and just getting out that first draft, which can seem so scary. Being able to just get it on the page has helped me a lot. In terms of kind of more, gosh, that's such a good question. And then for journalism, like I mentioned before, just maybe a heightened awareness. It's sort of the opposite, a heightened awareness to the writing, a heightened awareness to the craft, and to the quality of those sentences is something I'm learning from fiction, and I am thinking about a bit more. I haven't done much journalism since I started the fiction program, but it is something that I see informing my nonfiction.
What's your favorite part of the writing process, and is it the same for nonfiction and fiction? Like, where do you get the most pleasure when you're writing?
Getting published, see your name in print. And I think anyone who says otherwise is not telling the truth. But apart from that very narcissistic answer, I like that. Well, in journalism, it's the actual reporting. It's very fun to talk to people. The writing always seems like, oh, I can't believe I have to do this. And the editing is the worst. In fiction, you don't get to, well, for some fiction, you do research, but most fiction, you're not. So I like when you have that spark of something and there's a flow and you're really into the writing, that's wonderful. I hate revision, but that said, when you kind of figure out a puzzle piece and it slots in well, that's also very pleasurable. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I love revising. Okay, another question from the audience. You mentioned that the pandemic prevented you from going back to do more reporting. Can you tell us about how COVID has affected the region?
Sure. It's affected the region pretty differently. Cambodia has done remarkably well. They have one of the highest vaccination rates in Southeast Asia. For a while, they were higher than the US. And so they've done well in that regard. But unfortunately, they've really suffered economically. Obviously, Cambodia is a huge tourism country, and that's been basically nil. The other main way that they make their money is from manufacturing, garment manufacturing, and the shutdowns in China and the subsequent shutdowns in the West, and the hits to global supply chain also hit Cambodia really hard. So yeah, they've suffered economically quite a bit.
Okay, this one. First of all, I want to commend your courage to write this book. I echo that. How do you mitigate your own emotions, your mental health, and your involvement on the ground in writing and reporting on such a dire situation that in many ways seems helpless? Also, sending love from your BC community.
That's nice. I don't know, this is going to sound a little cold, but I was reporting in Cambodia for about 6 or 7 years, and I reported on a lot of very not nice things. Khmer Rouge tribunals or horrific crimes, or so I think I am somewhat inured to that. I'm not, it's sad to witness, but I'm not the one who is living there. So mostly I feel lucky. I go out reporting, I spend time with these people, then I can go back to a nice guest house where there's a roof and air conditioning and a hot shower if it's been pouring rain. And so I think, maybe it's just I have like an overly cold exterior, or I've been toughened up, but I would say I did not feel like it impacted my mental health. Maybe it should have, like it is, like we're talking about it, and it is awful and it is upsetting. And but I think generally when I'm reporting, and I haven't reported in war zones or anything like that, so that is probably quite different. I think most of us kind of can detach a little bit and say, I'm just here to tell a story. But we've also seen lots of people who that's worn them down over time. So yeah, but thank you for that question, and thank you for the kind words.
We have 2 questions here that are sort of related, and that's about if anyone in Cambodia has read the book, and what if they have, what has that reception been like? And if you know if it's going to be translated into the local language, and if it is, like, do you think that translation would change the narrative?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, lots of friends and Cambodian colleagues have read it. So first of all, I couldn't have done this without Cambodians, without several colleagues who translated, especially Chorn Chansi, who was an editor at the Cambodia Daily with me, and he came on one of the trips and was like a really significant translator, and a few other people. So very early on, like I sent copies to all the people who translated, because I wanted to make sure that there was nothing sensitive that would get anyone in trouble. I'm not saying anything that hasn't been like reported in depth in the local media, but you never know when you might inadvertently put something in a particular way that could get someone in trouble. So I had them reading copies, and then I sent it to some other people just to review and to look over. Those are all journalists or people who are like human rights people or sort of experts in the field. And their reception was all positive, but I haven't, I don't know if anyone in the government has read it or something like that. I would love if it would to be translated into Khmer. That would be awesome. I obviously, there's been a lot of interest in Cambodia, and I've said this on Twitter before, but like anyone who wants a PDF, I'd happily send it to them. My publishers, and Noah probably won't like that, but yeah, like I would like this to be widely read. It's been really heartening how interested people have been there. I've done some interviews with local media, which has been really fun. So yeah, it's, it would be amazing if it got translated into Khmer. I don't, if it changed it, I don't know. I mean, it would be interesting because all of the quotes were Khmer translated into English, cleaned up translations, and I don't have recordings of them. I just have my English language notebook. So then those would be translated back into Khmer, which is not ideal. Maybe we'd go back and re-report or talk to those people firsthand, because that's something that I think is really lost when you're doing that type of translation. That's another reason why it would have been great to go back to like be able to record people in depth and really capture their words instead of kind of a simulacra of their words. But
great. I think we'll do maybe one more question because we have two here that are related, from John and Larry. Do you have any novels or nonfiction that you think inform your writing voice or the way you structured this book? So any books, nonfiction or fiction?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good question. I really wish I had thought about that beforehand. I mean, before I went out, while I was writing this, I just bought a ton of books about nature, and I was reading a lot of John McPhee, who's sort of one of the best naturalists, but I got discouraged by that because his stuff is so character driven. Oh, I feel put on the spot. I'm so bad at remembering books I've read. I'm sure there are lots of books that have been incredibly inspiring in writing this.
Is there anyone from your your program that you've read recently that felt like, oh, this really relates? Or you're like, I don't know. We can't ask Abby about what she's reading because she's probably reading and writing so much in her MFA.
No, it's such a good question. I'm just, I will think about, who did you say Larry asked that?
Both Larry and John asked it. Yeah.
Okay, I'll email them personally when I look over this.
So then maybe we'll do one more quickly because we have time, and one just flew in and I really love it. Have you used the river as a setting within your fiction writing, or would you consider doing so?
Wow. I have not. I've thought about it. I guess I have been wary about, I certainly have plenty of fiction that takes place in Cambodia. I don't have fiction that takes place in places like this, I think, because it's such a different life and it's such a different, it feels hard for me to like accurately inhabit what a hungry villager is feeling and what they're, without it, become, and some people do it remarkably well. I kind of am wary about doing it. Not that I'm against it, like inherently. I think I just kind of, when I write about Cambodia, I gravitate to things that I'm more personally familiar with. So like I write about the War Crimes Tribunal a lot, for instance. I'll write about like local lawyers or journalists, or but I feel like, having spent a bit of time in these communities is not the same as working alongside people for years. And so I just feel like, but maybe I should. I mean, it's not a bad idea. Maybe I should push myself.
You can always write something and no one will ever see it.
That's true.
That's
true.
I know that publishing is your favorite part of it, but you can write something that doesn't get published, Abby.
I know. But no, most of my things don't get published. There's a stack that's big. Hi, Noah.
Hi, thank you both so much for this really very wonderful conversation. This has been fantastic, so engaging and interesting, and I'm learning a lot. So thank you both so much for this. Those of you at home, thank you for your very thoughtful questions as well, and please consider purchasing a copy of Troubling the Water from Community Bookstore. We hope to see you at another virtual event very soon. And yes, there it is. We have it in the store. You can get it from our website. Get your copy or ask Abby for a PDF. That's also wonderful. Yeah, thanks again. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Abby. Congratulations.
And thank you to the audience. Those were amazing questions.
Truly. Bye.
Bye.